Okay, I think we will get started. Welcome to this Center for the Americas seminar. The title of our presentation today is Dislodging Authoritarianism, the Brazilian Labor Ministry's Fight Against Neo-Slavery and Environmental Exploitation. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Ian Carrillo. He's an assistant professor in the Sociology department here at the University of Oklahoma. We're also pleased that his partner has also recently joined and will be speaking with us next semester, I hope. Before coming here, Dr. Carrillo was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which is where he went after completing his doctoral program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research has been supported by the Fulbright Association and the National Science Foundation. Dr. Carrillo uses qualitative and ethnographic methods to focus on the relationship between race and ethnicity, the environment, and political economy. He's working on a manuscript entitled Engines of Inequality, Regulating Race, Labor, and the Environment in Brazil. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrillo. And one of the things that we're doing in these presentations, we'll get to his research in just a moment, is also helping us to get to know each other, and in this case, helping everyone get to know a new faculty member. And so I wanted to ask Dr. Carrillo if you could please tell us a little bit something about your background and how you got interested in studying Brazil and in studying the topics that you study.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Looking back, one of the first moments where, let's say, Brazil got put on my map in terms of something I'd really developed an interest in was when I was a teenager. I bought an Os Mutantes CD, the Tropicalia band from the 60s. One of the reasons I knew about them was because Kurt Cobain tried to pay them a lot of money to do a reunion. And I was big into Nirvana. And then I was like, oh, this is the band that Kurt Cobain really liked. So maybe I should check them out too. And then from there, I learned their lyrics are about opposing a dictatorship. And there's a big political context to their sort of music making. And that opened up this world to sort of studying, let's say political history in a country like Brazil. And then later, when, into the LULA years, I was really intrigued by the sort of the policies that built a middle class, during the PT era. And, but also particularly interested in, these transformational policies that, particularly targeted rural and agricultural work, where that had really, for a long time, relied on really exploitative labor conditions. And basically, Lula's policies were really undermining this particular exploitative business model. And so from there, I'll talk about the agribusiness stuff today, but I also really focus a lot on the sugar ethanol industry. Although the sugar ethanol stuff plays a bit of a secondary role today, but it's a bigger part of my book. But the ones today talks more about the labor enforcement in the sort of greater Amazon region.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, we're excited to hear about your work. So please share your screen and go right ahead.
Sure thing. Okay. So it's great to be here today. I appreciate everybody that took the time to be here this afternoon on the end of Friday afternoon. So I'm going to be talking about some of my work that I've been doing on the Brazilian agribusiness sector for the last 2 years, where, like I mentioned, much of that work is focused on sugarcane in northeast and southern Brazil, Today, I'm talking more about agribusiness activities in the greater Amazon. Right, so, in my research, I've been interested in these intersections between labor processes and environmental activities. And so if you study, environmental justice issues in the North American context, the literature focuses a lot on things like racialized patterns and where hazardous facilities are cited, or how air quality differs across different communities. Right, but one big difference I see in looking at Brazil was that, a lot of these environmental justice discussions didn't really focus on activities where labor processes were intertwined with environmentally destructive practices. In Brazil, this relationship between labor exploitation and environmental exploitation is really common. So, as I'll talk about today, this particular labor environment connection, is often rooted in an authoritarian system, right, where vulnerable rural workers are entrapped in an exploitative situation with a strongman style boss. And so the question over the last couple of decades in Brazil has been how to break this authoritarian system, right? And how to enshrine more labor and environmental protections. So that's the focus of today's talk. So here's a brief outline of the presentation. First, I'll give some background on modern day slavery and environmental exploitation in the greater Amazon region. Then I'll discuss my research question and methods. Next, I'll talk about the political context in which the anti-slave task forces were created in the 1990s. Then I'll discuss the tactics that federal labor regulators used to dislodge authoritarianism. And then I'll conclude the talk by discussing what I think this all means for the challenges that we're currently facing. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me discuss some general background on modern day slavery and environmental exploitation in the Brazilian agribusiness sector. So between 1995 and 2020, more than 55,000 workers were rescued and to slavery. And these two figures here tell us the important basic trends over the last 25 years. So first, the chart on the left tells us the states where the most rescues have occurred. All right, and we see that it's in the states of Pará, Minas Gerais, Mato Grosso. All these states where agribusiness is a very strong presence. The state of Pará in northern Brazil is a place with high rates of deforestation and other forms of illegal economic activities, often involving informal labor. And so, for instance, the chart on the right shows the top 10 municipalities where labor infractions have been issued. And 7 of these municipalities come from Pará. The third highest municipality comes from the state of Maranhão, also a state very dependent on agribusiness and extractive activities. Right, but also note that the other 2 most cited municipalities are the cities of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So slavery and labor exploitation aren't just a thing of undeveloped rural areas, right? But also, it also happens in areas seen as the most cosmopolitan in Brazil. In rural areas account for the lion's share of modern day slavery. About 90% of rescued workers were working in some form of rural activity. Cattle ranching had 30% of cases, the most of any other activity. Sugarcane had 25%, the second highest. Then it was just farming in general at 19%. Then there is activities like charcoal extraction at 8% and deforestation, 5%. So these are all activities that are quite labor intensive and where workers are exposed to environmental hazards that pose dangers to their health and safety. And so this is the type of work that most workers avoid and where agribusiness producers have difficulty recruiting labor through formal processes. So many agribusiness producers utilize strategies involving forced and coerced labor, where marginalized workers become entrapped in exploitative systems that are difficult to escape. And, in studying the racial and ethnic dynamics of rescued workers, we see that rural workers of color are more likely to become ensnared in modern day slavery. So when I say non-white workers, I mean Black, mixed race, Bardo, Asian, and Indigenous. So this non-white population represents just over 50% of the overall Brazilian population, but 76% of rescued workers. Meanwhile, whites are 47% of the Brazilian population, but only account for 23% of the rescued workers. Right, so these dynamics are useful for how we can think of, racial capitalism and white supremacy operating in practice. So it's clear that enslavers target people of color. Rural work in Brazil has long had a racialized history involving chattel slavery and sharecropping. And because there was never any restitution made for these moral crimes, these non-white populations remain vulnerable to modern forms of labor exploitation. But how might we explain the 23% of white rescued workers? So on the one hand, Brazilian elites have not been shy to mix class exploitation with labor exploitation, right? And confessing to classism has often been a defense against charges of racism in Brazil. So we shouldn't be surprised in this context that white workers are also subjected to extreme labor exploitation. At the same time, race scholars have argued that white supremacy is a form of, or a system of elite domination that eventually consumes poor whites as well. Right, James Baldwin argued this point long ago. Heather McGee more currently has made this claim. Right, so in a context like rural Brazil, where social relations are extremely stratified, elites will often treat poor whites as a disposable resource when necessary to satisfy the needs of elites. So I'm working on this topic for another paper, and I can talk more about that later. Right, but this issue of combating slavery in interior Brazil engages longstanding debates in sociology and political science. Max Weber wrote extensively about the dichotomy between societies defined by patrimonialism or bureaucratic rationalization. Patrimonial societies were seen as pre-modern and oriented around tribal politics, with little interest in principles like equality. And rational societies were often defined as modern and believing in the importance of science and laws and universalism and human treatment. So one of the questions in people doing this research, doing research in this tradition is, understanding how societies transition from being patrimonial to being rational. And a related line of research is on how societies transform from authoritarian to democratic. So this research is broadly interested in understanding changes in social practices, legal systems, and political culture. Some recent work, that's been informed today's talk for me, looks at the long process of breaking authoritarian enclaves in the Jim Crow South, right, to slowly extend democratic principles into the region. So going into the 1990s, authoritarianism and patrimonialism still define much of Brazilian agribusiness, right? Especially in the greater Amazon region where the federal government's presence was minimal. So on plantations and fazendas in Brazil, patrimonial authority was a defining feature. Brazilian scholars argue that a distinct form of patrimonialism existed in the Brazilian context. Right, it was a ruling ideology defined by three people: the unrivaled authority of a patriarchal figure, most often the male owner of the plantation, Portuguese called the senhor de engenho. Right. Secondly, there was the inviolable power of the private family. Right, this was paramount. Right, as elite families saw their plantations as tiny republics that the public authority had no right to intervene. The third feature of patrimonialism was the creation of government institutions oriented around a style of family capitalism that elites dominated. So this meant that extensive nepotism and state capture blurred the lines between the private family and the public sector. And central to all this was something called the power to command, or mandonismo. This refers to the seniorial authority to dominate subordinates and to freely exploit environmental resources. So for plantation owners, this includes sorting people into class, racial, and gendered hierarchies, including family members, as well as enslaved people. And it also involves elites arranging nature to their desires, right? Like, remove that forest, I want cattle or soy on that land. Redirect that river, I want to use that water to irrigate my sugarcane fields. And so to elites, the power to command is a cherished virtue, right? Considered essential to binding society, environment, and economy in a moral order. So for elites, when their power to command is unchallenged, and they can dictate to others how to behave, then elites, that they think that everything in the world is in its right place. So since their identity is so intertwined with wielding authority, it isn't surprising to see elites lash out when their authority is challenged. So take, for example, the Monica brothers, right? Picture here, right? The siblings who own plantations in Minas Gerais. And in 2004, they ordered the murder of 4 Ministry of Labor agents who came to inspect reports of slave labor on their plantations. And so in my research, I asked, what tactics did federal labor regulators utilize to dislodge patrimonialism and authoritarianism in rural Brazil, interior Brazil? I argue that regulators challenged the mechanisms and everyday routines, social structures, and political cultures where criminal employers exercise their power. And these challenges involved closing legal loopholes that benefited plantation owners and enshrining legal and social protections for workers vulnerable to labor exploitation in environmentally hazardous work. So for my research methods, I conducted an extended case study of Brazil's agribusiness sector. This involved 3 forms of data collection. First, I conducted in-depth interviews with more than 140 agribusiness elites, federal labor regulators, rural union leaders, and rural workers. I conducted ethnographic observations at rural work sites, including mills and plantations in the sugar ethanol industry. And I conducted a document analysis of government documents, media reports, and industry reports. And I carried out this research over 18 months in 2015 and 2019. So while my project entailed talking to a variety of actors involved with the agribusiness sector, today's talk focuses on federal labor regulators. And this includes labor inspectors from the Ministry of Labor, labor prosecutors from the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office, and judges from the Regional Labor Tribunal. Right, so I use the term regulator in a very broad sense. Basically, I see these group of people as being responsible for enforcing compliance with labor laws and regulations in Brazil. And I conducted these interviews with regulators in the states of Pernambuco, Alagoas, Sao Paulo, Rio Grande do Norte, and Rio de Janeiro. And all the people I interviewed were living and working in these states. They all had extensive experience in anti-slave activities, including personal involvement in creating and developing the anti-slavery task force units in the 1990s. Or these folks started their careers working in anti-slavery task forces in the late 90s and the 2000s. So going into the first part of the 1990s, right? Several political factors converged that led to the creation of federal anti-slave task force activities. Perhaps the most important factor was the ongoing efforts by the Pastoral Land Commission, to sound the alarm about the existence of slavery in interior Brazil. Right, the Pastoral Land Commission is a Catholic group oriented around liberation theology, right, and they have been doing a lot of grassroots work to combat slavery since the 1970s, right, and they did these activities at great risk to their health and safety. In 1993, the Pastoral Land Commission presented a formal denunciation of slavery at the International Labor Organization, right, which put some international pressure on Brazil. And around this time, the Secretary of Inspection in the Brazilian federal government lobbied the Itamar Franco presidency for more support to combat slavery, but received little political support. And this context started to shift in 1995. President Fernando Henrique Cardoso was willing to provide more support to fight slavery. In 1995, Fernando Henrique dedicated an episode of his weekly radio address to the issue of slavery. He framed the issue around how slavery would diminish market opportunities for Brazilian products, saying that global buyers would not want to buy Brazilian beef made with slave labor or beef produced through slavery and deforestation. And he pledged to make investments in civil servants and bureaucratic resources to fight slavery. And before I go to the next slide, point out here that today is the National Day for combating slave labor, January 28th, today's date. And so this was a holiday that was founded after to honor to honor the victims of enslavement and the people who died fighting slavery, right? So this murder that I was referencing here that these plantation owners carried out against the Ministry of Labor Workers was on January 28th, 2004. And so they chose January 28th as the day as this national holiday. So just a little bit of backstory about the importance of today's day. So in 1995, the Secretary of Inspection signed a ministerial order creating this the Federal Mobile Auditing Group, right? Commonly known as the Mobile Group, right? That was a colloquial name for it. They called it the Mobile Group. And so this task force would be responsible for investigating and rescuing enslaved workers, right? And this ministerial order also gave labor inspectors authority to define the conditions that constituted work analogous to slavery. One important first task was to assemble the members of this task force, right? So I spoke with some of the founding members of the Mobile Group, and they told me that they looked for certain traits in the people that they wanted to invite, right? They wanted people who are highly respected within the profession, people who are familiar with rural activities and rural life, people who are tolerant of intense and dangerous travel, and people with a deep commitment to eradicating slave labor. A founding member of the Mobile Group described to me what she saw as their most important first achievement, right? You know, I compare our work to construction. We dug out a foundation, laid the foundation, built the walls, because nothing existed. Just an entryway that was previously done for combating child labor. And that doorway opened many possibilities for our work. So she's communicating the enormous task in front of them, but with a reference to child labor laws, but she's also indicating that they were looking for institutional language and institutional authority that they could use to build on and expand their activities. And so when the Mobile Group began activities in the greater Amazon, they were basically going into a world where criminal employers wielded considerable authority. These types of employers dominated the political culture as major political donors or with family members embedded throughout the political system. These elites had allies in key administrative posts, such as the local labor departments, and they often controlled local police forces or had rural militias. Even the ownership of private infrastructure in rural areas like gas stations or hotels gave them structural power, gave them a structural advantage. And so on plantations, the mobile group unearthed a vast web of exploitation. Plantation owners targeted impoverished areas to lure desperate individuals into migrants and temporary work. Owners used third-party recruiters called gatos to recruit workers. And this provided owners a degree of plausible deniability in these illegal activities. They could always say, I don't know anything about it. It must have been the gato that I used. He's doing his own thing. So recruiters purposely use debt to entrap workers, right? Extending lines of credit for transportation and daily needs. And on plantations and fazendas, workers lived in degrading conditions, lacked clean water, lived alongside animals, slept on dirt floors, slept outside in tents. Armed guards often took worker documents and prohibited them from leaving the plantation. There were many cases of enslaved workers trying to leave and were killed trying to leave. And plantation owners were also able to evade culpability through the widespread use of relodging, the practice of creating fake landownership deeds. And so this made it difficult to pinpoint who was the true owner of a plantation. And plantation owners also received advice from their attorneys on how to avoid responsibility, like rarely visiting a plantation so that enslaved workers wouldn't be able to physically identify the owner. And so this was a world of legal ambiguity. And this ambiguity often or did benefit plantation owners because they wielded so much power throughout their particular local society. And the mobile group saw that a lot of the labor and human rights violations that they witnessed didn't correspond well to existing laws and protocols. So the first strategy they took was to simply document what they saw, write and submit reports, and make bureaucratic recommendations on how to proceed. And another early tactic was to federalize auditing power, something that the Pastoral Land Commission had long recommended. And so one aim was to enhance the presence of the states in the Brazilian interior. The federal government didn't have a strong footprint there. So auditors saw their job as carving out a space for the federal government and to extend representation of the state to the people living and working in the interior. And auditors also recognized that local authorities faced considerable constraints. Local regulators were either captured by oligarchic interests, or they faced threats against their safety if they went against oligarchic interests. So this dynamic showed why the mobile group had to be mobile. As one of the task force members explains, right, in this quote, mobile group members could travel to a site, conduct the operation, interrupt the criminal activity, and then leave. Local auditors didn't have this freedom to escape potential backlash from local authoritarians. And auditors also justified expanding their authority by pointing to the 1988 Federal Constitution, which endowed all workers with protected rights. So while rural workers were long excluded from national labor legislation, the 1988 Constitution had more universalistic language that auditors drew from to justify more aggressive activities against slave labor. An additional strategy was to expand prosecutorial and judicial powers within mobile group activities. A lot of the inspection reports that auditors initially wrote in the very beginning had little impact since the policing powers of auditors was limited, and following through with inspector reports required involvement from other institutions. So since a lot of these initial reports just were submitted into the sort of federal bureaucracy and then nobody followed up with them, they just kind of got lost in the system. It was fundamental to get labor prosecutors and labor judges on board with these operations. And an initial problem was that a lot of key institutional actors were extremely skeptical of mobile group activity, right? Like this quote shows, people thought the problem of slavery wasn't real and that the mobile group was just inventing a problem so that they could go pretend to be heroes while traveling the country on taxpayer money. Right, and this skepticism from peers really bothered the mobile group members, who knew, these members knew that they were trying to eradicate a serious problem that was plaguing Brazilian society. But little by little, and through persistence and meticulous documentation of violations, the mobile group eventually came to develop stronger institutional relationships. So labor inspectors noted several key breakthrough moments with prosecutors and judges. One judge personally witnessed dozens of enslaved workers in his courtroom and was presented with extensive evidence of their past living and working conditions. And the ruling that this judge made established an important precedent that anti-slave enforcement could build on. And leadership in the public prosecutor's office also began to take slavery seriously and started to align their institution with the Ministry of Labor to fulfill these objectives. So this cross-institutional involvement really elevated mobile group activity. Now auditors could communicate with prosecutors and judges about what evidence they should look for and how to document it. And this helped with the prosecutorial and judiciary process, right? This streamlining also allowed regulators to create new protocols and norms that they would then institutionalize. And so overall, with auditors, prosecutors, and judges all working within their own expertise toward the same goal, they could confront criminal employers in a more lasting, more durable way. And showing up as a team for inspections really lent more legitimacy to their operation. And another development was the addition of the federal police to mobile group activities. So this was necessary because auditors had endured a lot of death threats in their operations. In some cases, these threats were direct. Like one auditor recounted to me how she had done an operation in the northeastern state of Alagoas, where she uncovered hundreds of kids doing child labor in sugarcane. And the head of the Sugarcane Producers Association there delivered a message to her that if she ever came back to Alagoas, she would never leave. And in other cases, auditors knew that plantation owners could be more subtle in their violence. Like as this quote says, they worried that plantation owners might run auditors off a rural highway and kill them and make it look like it was just a car wreck. Right, and there was this case I mentioned earlier in Minas Gerais involving the murder of the four Ministry of Labor officials. Right, and there's in the state of Alagoas, a tax collector was murdered in the 90s. So there's violence against people doing engaging in activities that scrutinize elite power. It is a very dangerous activity. And so having the federal police there was fundamental for safety. And right, and it mattered that they came from the federal government and not the local government, since local police and the local military police were likely captured by oligarchic interests and likely could not be trusted. But nonetheless, the federal police were initially skeptical of anti-slave activities. And basically, some workers ensnared in slavery were trying to hide from a crime that they had committed. And the federal police thought that they were being too soft towards criminals who are undeserving of sympathy. So the common trope in Brazil that it's better to be working than committing a crime was really pervasive among the police, right? But little by little, the auditors were able to convince police that forced labor and enslaved labor is a human rights violation, even if that person is a criminal. So another major tactic involved bringing rescued workers out of the margins. And this was an enormous task. These workers were very disconnected from society, which wasn't accidental. An aim of enslavers was to make workers lose their sense of humanity and lose their sense of social connectedness, right? To make workers feel as if no world existed for them outside the plantation. But regulators used several strategies to resolve this issue. An initial step was to inform the worker of their situation, tell them that they no longer owe any debt to the owner, that debt was illegal and therefore void, and to inform workers that they had been in a situation of modern day slavery. And this was a surprise for many workers. Regulators also told workers that they had constitutional protections as workers and human beings, and that these workers would now be free to leave the plantation and would have paid transport back to their home region. And mobile group members described to me how this news elicited a wave of emotions from workers, right? From sadness to relief to excitement at being able to return. And a critical part of rescuing workers also involved ending the informalization that characterized their existence as citizens and workers. So most workers either didn't have official worker cards or they had the cards confiscated by the plantation owner. So the task of regulators was to restore the formal identity of rescued workers. So this meant creating official ID cards and registering formal worker cards. And so this was another area where protocols and norms were very vague, since they were trying to do this administrative activity in remote rural areas. The task force members discovered a solution to their problem when they saw that there was language in the federal labor legislation that gave regulators authority to make temporary worker cards. And so this innovative tactic allowed regulators to give workers legal identities and make it more difficult for employers to force them back into informal work. Right, but this gets to, I think, one of the bigger pictures, thinking here about this bureaucratic enforcement. But the mobile group was often learning by doing and constantly confronting many complex situations where it was unclear what the best path of action would be. And one told me that, every time they found more workers, more challenges presented themselves. And one major challenge was what to do with workers once they were rescued. Regulators realized that paying to send them back home was important, but that they could just get trapped again in exploitative employment. And such workers may be even more vulnerable post-rescue since they had been so disconnected from society. And one strategy was to create unemployment insurance for the rescued. Regulators hoped that this would fend off economic desperation and provide a financial cushion for these workers to establish a more stable life. Okay, so let me briefly summarize some important points for this period between 1995 and 2002. So in these years, the mobile group really laid the institutional groundwork that would serve as a basis for labor enforcement throughout the Brazilian economy in subsequent years. The mobile group developed norms, protocols, and procedures, and in doing so, they eliminated the ambiguity around legal violations, and bureaucratic plans of action. So they made a blueprint for others to build on. And I see this period as one of the most dynamic for labor enforcement in agribusiness. And now I want to briefly discuss some key moments of the LULA presidency and start to bring us back to the present day. So in 2003, LULA began the first of his 2 terms as president. And as leader of the Workers' Party, he made pro-labor policy the pillar of his agenda. And in pursuing these goals, he really benefited from some of the bureaucratic improvements to labor enforcement that preceded him. And so in my interviews with labor regulators, many went out of their way to tell me how transformational the Fernando Henrique presidency was to their work. Right, he has sort of a complicated legacy when it comes to being pro-labor, being anti-labor. Right, and so these regulators I interviewed, it wasn't they didn't like LULA. They were very pleased with how LULA supported their work, but they wanted me to know that a lot of work went into changing the labor ministry before LULA took off. And nonetheless, LULA went out of his way to honor the members of the Mobile Group. He invited them to the presidential palace to meet him. Right, and so the woman pictured here with LULA, right? She was one of the founding members of the Mobile Group, right? And some respondents told me that these first years of LULA were a high point in their career for having their work taken seriously. And the labor ministry became a high prestige institution, right? You get to go meet the president and he gets to honor you. And as one of my interviews told me, they said at the time, everybody wanted to be a labor inspector. Right, so as I bring us back to the present, let me touch on some of these key policies from the LULA era. So 2 of these policies, right, were national plans to eradicate slavery. The first of these plans went into place in 2003, and it formalized and deepened a lot of changes that were already happening. Right, it entailed creating more labor ministry offices in the interior of Brazil, strengthening racial relationships between institutions, strengthening legal definitions around labor violations, raising awareness of the problem of slavery, creating victim compensation programs, and creating rules allowing the state to seize land where enslaved workers were discovered. And this last objective here, to expand the civil society. This entailed offering more entrance exams so more people could enter the labor inspector profession. And so these exams, called the concurso público, were extremely important because it's not guaranteed that they'll be offered. And if the pool of labor inspectors does not grow or get replenished without these exams. The second national plan to eradicate slavery went into place in 2008. This plan extended many of the goals of the first plan, but also expanded investments in other areas like research, media, and protection of foreign workers. So both of these plans aimed to break the linkages between child labor and enslaved labor, child labor and slave labor involving working age adults. Labor regulators saw that child labor often preceded enslavement as a working age adult. And plantation owners try to socialize children into brutal work so they see it as normal when they're older. In interviews that I conducted with elites in the sugarcane industry, right? These elites compared child workers, children to puppies, right? Saying it was necessary to train these children to become obedient adults. And they said that policies for universal education would deplete their labor pool and therefore threaten their business model. So ending this cycle where child labor feeds into slave labor was really important, right? And I can talk about more of this in the Q&A. The third key policy in the LULA era was the dirty list. So the dirty list is a publicly available registry of employers who submitted workers to conditions analogous to slavery. This policy was enacted in 2004, but had been an idea of the mobile group for years before, right? So basically the dirty list disciplined employers in three ways. First, it made the company name, the owner name, and the crime publicly available, which, right, this brought embarrassment and status loss to the business owner, right? And so these business owners, often consider themselves exemplars of morality, paragons of citizenship, right? So announcing their criminal behavior publicly really strikes against, their sense of identity. And the dirty list also decreased the attractiveness of those companies to investors and consumers, since people don't want to be associated with the company who engages in slavery. And lastly, if a company appeared on the dirty list, it was prohibited from accessing credit and financing from state-owned banks. So in Brazil, since most banking is done through these banks, losing access can really undercut a company's competitiveness. And this was the point of the dirty list, right? To really hit criminal employers in their pocketbook and make it so that the punishment for slavery is so severe that it is no longer an acceptable business risk to take. And the dirty list also sought to cut off linkages between labor fines and state banking. So one of the things that the Mobile Group discovered early on was that the state-owned banks in Brazil were providing financing to activities involving slavery and deforestation. And these Mobile Group members were especially horrified by this because one of the ways that these banks are capitalized is through worker funds, right? So there's this important cycle here, that when an employer pays a labor fine, that fine goes into a federal worker fund called FAT. And this worker fund keeps their fund growing by investing their money in state-owned banks. And state-owned banks then lend money to whatever activity seems profitable, including agribusiness activities involving slavery and deforestation. So basically, worker fines were going into a pool of capital used to finance labor and environmental violations. And labor inspectors wanted to end this cycle. And one way of doing so was prohibiting employers who ended up on the dirty list from accessing these state banks. So during the LULA era, there was a vast increase in investment and activities to end slave labor. Between 2003 and 2009, the number of task force operations grew by 500%, and the number of establishments inspected grew by 400%. There were additional increases in the amount of fines collected from criminal employers and the number of infractions issued. So it's not just that work sites were being inspected, but inspectors were issuing fines, prosecutors were prosecuting criminal employers, and fines were actually being collected. And there was also improvements in the efficiency of labor audits. From 2005 onward, labor regulators got better at targeting which businesses were engaging in labor violations. And this is likely due to better communication between workers, labor unions, and civil society groups, and the Ministry of Labor. So basically, these groups could communicate with labor inspectors to let them know that labor violations were occurring at their place of employment. And agribusiness elites really worked hard to discredit the work of labor regulators, right? So this came out in my interviews with elites, right? And so their hatred of the labor ministry came out in a couple of ways relevant to this question. So for example, looking at this figure, one might say, what an efficient use of taxpayer money, right? But elites say, these inspectors are just issuing infractions because they have to justify their salaries, per diems, and bureaucratic budgets. So they're just charging us with ticky-tacky charges, right? So therefore, we need to close the labor ministry to stop this. Now imagine if labor inspectors targeted business through a totally randomized process. elites would say, what a waste of money. How inefficient. And the labor ministry is just harassing innocent law-abiding employers. We need to close the labor ministry to stop this nonsense. Right, so there's no real scenario where these elites would consider federal scrutiny over their business activities legitimate. And we see this the first day of the Bolsonaro presidency. He essentially closes the Ministry of Labor, transfers the remaining functions to the Ministry of Economy. The ministry is greatly weakened, right? And this is one of the big projects that Bolsonaro was elected to do on behalf of the agribusiness elite. And after LULA, especially after the 2016 impeachment of Dilma, the resources of the labor ministry were seriously diminished. The graph on the left shows that funding for anti-slavery task forces plummeted. In 2020, this funding was at its lowest levels in years. And the graph on the right shows that the number of workers rescued has fallen steadily, even though the rate of enslavement has likely increased due to labor reforms. And the federal government has basically stopped offering the entrance exams for labor inspectors, right? These concursus publicus that you see on the right, the figure on the right. Right, so while LULA offered several of these public exams during his presidency, the last one offered was in 2013. So essentially, since Bolsonaro took office, or I should say, so especially since Bolsonaro took office, we've seen a wave of retirements among older labor inspectors with very few new people coming into the profession. So this is all part of a conservative strategy to shrink the pool of bureaucrats who threatened elite power over the last 25 years. And to wrap up here, we've recently seen, two different visions of rural Brazil. Right, so these tweets were sent out from LULA and the Bolsonaro government on the National Farmers Day back in July. So LULA's vision portrays a sense of sovereignty and dignity in agricultural work for rural workers and small producers. And the tweet from Bolsonaro, the Bolsonaro government on the right, portrays this vision of a rural landlord who imposes hierarchical order through violence and intimidation. And so this is the patrimonial vision that Bolsonaro wanted to restore, right? Especially it involves the use of guns as a tool of power, right? And many agribusiness elites elected him precisely because they wanted to reclaim their lost authority and power. But I do want to emphasize here, this is my final point, I do want to emphasize that although things are quite bleak right now, it's important to remember that the political winds will shift again and labor enforcement will regain its footing. And when it does, it will not be in the same situation that it was in the early 90s, right? The last 25 years of labor enforcement led to the creation of very detailed protocols, norms, laws, and institutional practices, right? And these blueprints and this expertise for how to combat labor and environmental exploitation now exist. They don't need to be reinvented. So when the political context does shift again in favor of worker rights, there will be a relatively strong sense of institutional preparedness. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions, comments.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrillo. This is very, very interesting. For those of us who know a little bit about Brazil, fascinating. I imagine for those for whom Brazil is completely new, also quite interesting. There's one point I'd like just to begin with as a question, but first, before I say anything else, I would like to invite those who are participating this afternoon to post questions to the question and answer function, and we will read those and incorporate those. There's one question there that we'll get to in just a moment, but just a starting point. A lot of the discussion today was about modern slavery. And for those of us who are perhaps not entirely clear about this, could you clarify the concept and how it's applied. What kind of working conditions constitute slavery or neo-slavery in the context of what you are dealing with? I'm sure the labor inspectors are dealing also with other kinds of infractions of various kinds, but what does slavery mean in the context that you're discussing it? And if you could give some examples.
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, so they essentially had like a checklist, and they were very clear that like not everything was slavery. And so they would have like a checklist of, let's say, like 10 violations, and if like 2 of them were checked, that wouldn't constitute slavery. But it was something like, oh, this person isn't free to leave. They sleep outside in the tent. It looks like they share water with farm animals. It looks like they sleep maybe where they work. This kind of thing. Once you start to accumulate 4 or 5 traits all happening at the same time, then they'll say that, okay, this counts as modern day slavery. Especially if it's something of like freedom of movement is violated. It was like a big one. And so, but you know, the agribusiness elites I talked to, they would try to ridicule all of this, be like, oh, the worker dormitories, their mattresses weren't soft enough. We're going to call it slavery. And so this is the sort of like tactic they would use to minimize the seriousness of it, and completely misrepresent what was actually going on. And so, you know, even in my interviews with regulators with these labor auditors, they would say like, look, we get these calls sometimes from workers, and they say there's slavery happening here, but we don't think that there is. We think that they make up this like thing of slavery to get us there faster. And so basically they're like, some of the claims are fraudulent, and we work through them. You know, like they were pretty honest about the complexity of the situation, and you know, pretty firm about like, you know, we don't think everything is slavery, and even when workers make false claims, we can sort through those.
And in your own travels and research, were you able to ever actually witness or see any of these things, or are these things not things that you could have access to?
You know, let me think. You know, most of my time was spent in, on these sugarcane plantations and mills. And so what you saw there was like less migratory work. So I started doing my research around the time that these mills in the Northeast have kind of stopped doing migratory labor. It diminished a lot. They still do it. But basically, these labor enforcers started really looking at the state of the dormitories that these workers would come from, like the interior of the state, from the Sertão or the Agreste, and basically being like, saying like, you're getting a fine for these dormitories. Like these beds are horrific, showers are horrific, and basically raise the cost of doing business for them, where the mills were like, we're going to try to get local labor now. But at the same time, the workers I interviewed that were like age 25, they grew up as sharecroppers. And so they don't, that practice is less common now, particularly because of labor enforcement. And so now these workers live on like, the periphery of like small towns. Right. So it's, the labor exploitation is changing a bit. It's taking new forms, but yeah, I mean, it's a question of, you know, I mean, the sharecropping was very normalized by folks in this coastal area of the Northeast. Right. And I would say, like, I don't think it's modern day slavery, but it's, you know, exploitative.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So let me get to a question that's been posed here. Michele Moraes de Sai Silva asks, first of all, thanks you for the presentation. And she noted that the mobile group needed the support from federal police in order to safely do their work. And that the fact that labor inspectors need to wear bulletproof vests or police-like vests, those kinds of things, also points to the need to reinforce their authority. The question is, does this end up replacing authoritarianism by something that still carries an authoritative aesthetic?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, especially, if you have a sort of critical view of policing, right? And I've certainly thought through this, in some of the way that I've been thinking through the interview data and all this. And and I do wonder if it's something to the extent of, Michelle, I'd love to chat with you later about this. But I do wonder if it's something to the extent of like, this is the sort of like symbolic authority that rural elites would respect. Maybe if like that's the aesthetic that you need to do to garner to generate fear among the rural elite, is that you have to adopt forms of power that maybe they would respect. But I was shifting this like a little bit. A couple of the inspectors I spoke with were talking about the liberalizing gun laws that Bolsonaro carried out, or that he was intended to do. And they clearly saw this as a way to empower rural elites to use violence against, like, quote unquote, intruding federal authority in their activities, right? They were like, oh, it's not common that a plantation owner has a gun in his holster or something like that, and he lets you know about it. And so they were like, we're not gonna. So one of the suggestions was like, we arm ourselves when we do these audits, and they're just like, no, it's gonna be a shootout between us and the plantation owner. And so it was again this thing of I don't know a great answer to Michelle's question of like, how do you like de-escalate the situation, and what is the right type of like aesthetic power that you wield.
Another question comes from Paulo Moreira. He asks, how do regulators see the case of Unai, especially the fact that the Manica brothers are still free, even though one of them has been sentenced to 60 years in prison?
I didn't ask them about like this particular detail of the of this case, but a lot of folks talked about the Unai massive, like that came up a lot. And I think that I would say that they weren't surprised. I think that they have a very many have a very oops, sorry about that. I think that they would say like, this is how we expect the legal system to operate in Brazil for very powerful people. Very powerful people don't really go to jail. And if they do, it's just temporary embarrassment, and then they are back on their feet. And so I don't know, this case of like, even this case of like Minas, the particular massacre happened, for folks that don't know, this particular massacre happened in the state of Minas Gerais. And this was during the LULA era. And some folks said like, these labor inspectors went out to this plantation and they didn't have any police protection. And that the particular head of the state labor delegation in Minas was a little too close to agribusiness there, and that he didn't like give them enough, didn't make the political and material investments to make the job of labor inspectors safe. And they kind of said like, yeah, we think this is like a bargain that LULA made to like not put somebody who's going to push too hard in this post in Minas. And then after this massacre, then it became the rule that like, anytime people are going out to inspect slave labor, they're going to federal police, no questions asked. But this question of impunity against elites, it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, this is just a follow up on that, and just for clarification, it was clear from your presentation that local elites, local state officials and such were unreliable in these functions, and that's why federal police and federal inspectors, federal auditors were needed in each of these cases. does the impunity that we're talking about is the impunity at the federal level, or were these people prosecuted only at, say, state level or something like that?
I need to look closer at this case of these plantation brothers. I think it probably like varies from case to case, but I think like with the I think one of the projects of the mobile group and their activities afterward is to elevate all this stuff to the level of a federal crime.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether or not that was the case with these plantation brothers,
Mm-hmm.
I can't say for sure, but I do know that what they wanted to do a lot was to make these serious labor violations of federal crimes, and it was there was a lot of legal ambiguity before that.
Yeah.
If these violations could rise to that level.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. In your presentation, you helped us see connections between labor issues and environmental issues. On the one hand, you talked also about child labor and such. One of the questions asked by Abrar Hassani is about indigenous rights and how those might intersect with these labor issues. How are indigenous workers represented in the demographics of the places that you were studying? Are indigenous people specifically targeted in any way?
This is an aspect that I don't know too much about, the issue of indigenous rights there, but I can speak more broadly to this issue of like these like racial and ethnic dynamics around modern day slavery. So I did ask these mobile group members, like all the regulators, if they thought what they were witnessing, if racial discrimination contributed to the problem of modern day slavery, racial discrimination or ethnic or skin color discrimination. And most of them were adamant that no, they didn't see racial discrimination to be a problem. And it was part of it was this. It was basically like echoing this like racial democracy language, right? That like no, the problem here is Brazil is more classism than racism, right? And so they kind of explained to me like they don't go targeting people based on like race and skin color. All these plantation owners care about is trying to find cheap labor. What cheap labor that can they ensnare and lure back to their agribusiness work? It's about class and it's about economics and economic vulnerability. And I thought like, okay, that's part of it. But clearly you study the history of rural Brazil and you see that like who the vulnerable populations are is a racialized story behind it. And the data bears out that like most of the people that are rescued come from primarily, Black and brown municipalities. The rescued workers are primarily Black and brown, like I mentioned earlier. So it's something that I'm like working on in the paper, is like sorting through these particular racial and ethnic dynamics. And there were some who, a couple auditors who said, oh yeah, absolutely, this is a racism problem. Brazil's got a huge racism problem. And one person who I spoke to gave me this like, this is a story of employers targeting vulnerable populations. And then I gave a sort of an answer. She kind of ended up being like, but maybe white people are less likely to end up in this vulnerable situation. And kind of like took her like a roundabout way, but then ended up kind of being like, maybe racist. That's
Did you see, to the extent that you've seen this kind of thing, can you see that those doing the exploiting are generally of a different racial category than those being exploited, or is there more similarity?
I would have to look. That's a good question. I'd have to look. I don't know enough about interior Brazil to make a strong claim. I can say that. So I would say that the people who on the sort of like skin color spectrum, yeah, it's gonna like tend toward whiteness with a lot of variability. in the sugarcane industry, and I was in Pernambuco and Alagoas in Sao Paulo.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very clear skin color hierarchy, or let's say, yeah, like a skin color. All the plantation owners, the mill owners, they're all white.
Mm-hmm.
There was,
mm-hmm.
like, if I asked somebody why there aren't any black mill owners, it would probably elicit
Mm-hmm.
confusion. It's so rare. Like, I've never even heard of an anecdotal case of it. But most of the rural workers are black and brown.
Yeah.
And I dined in these like cafeteria halls, the manager and owner of cafeteria halls on these mills when I did these visits. It was a very white space in a very, black and brown dominated when you look at like
mm-hmm.
who's doing the work,
yeah.
right? The managerial space is very white.
And let me just follow up with one other question. This is from my own, what I don't know is the region you were looking at was mostly the Northeast, right? Or were you looking beyond?
It was in the Northeast. A lot of my sugarcane stuff was in the Northeast and the state of Sao Paulo.
In Sao Paulo. Is there a significant indigenous population in those places?
Yeah. Again, I'm not super familiar with indigenous groups in Brazil. In the Northeast, yes, there are indigenous groups in the interior that's kind of have this like history of sort of Afro-indigenous,
mm-hmm.
Over the course of the colonization,
mm-hmm.
right? And in Sao Paulo, I really have a hard time venturing an explanation.
Yeah. Very good. If there is anyone else in the audience who would like to ask a question, please do. Let me just ask one other thing, just coming back to your role here at the university. Maybe you could tell us just a little bit about what kinds of things you're teaching. I'm thinking that some of the people attending this might be students, might be interested in taking something someday. What do you teach here?
So, of most relevance to this group, I imagine, I teach a class on global inequality.
Mm-hmm.
I taught this last fall, and I'm scheduled to teach it next fall.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a class with a big Latin American focus. I have a master's in Latin American studies and a lot of work in Brazil. And so, yeah, the class ends up having a pretty big focus on the Americas. But yeah, the big themes in it are around like, colonization, race, development, climate change. I would say that immigration and migration, these are some of the big issues that I focus on. And then I also teach a class on like an introductory class on race and ethnicity in sociology. And this one has a pretty strong US focus, although I do blend, intersperse things from like Brazil and maybe other parts of Latin America when it's appropriate.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to begin to bring this to a close then. First of all, by thanking you. It's hard your first year to take time out to do something like this. I know you've been very busy with both your research work and teaching, but we're very pleased that you are here and part of the Latin Americanist and Caribbeanist community here on campus, and we hope to see you in person before too long, that we get back to more in-person events as soon as we get through some of these variants that are coming through. I'd also like to thank the Center for Brazil Studies that co-sponsored this event, and also mention that we have a couple of upcoming events. The next upcoming event is also a Center for Brazil Studies event, and that is that on Thursday, February 17th, from 1:30 to 2:45 p.m., there will be an in-person presentation given. I believe it will also be offered via Zoom, but it will be in person in Zero Hall. And this is a presentation that looks at how a family from the popular classes in Recife looked at the dynamics of the 2018 presidential elections, right? It's an in-depth ethnographic study of a family who have different views about the choices made. The speaker is Benjamin Jung, an anthropology professor from State University of New York in New Paltz. We also have upcoming events on the rest of the semester. I won't give you the entire list, but we have several other speakers coming this semester. Thanks also to Stephanie Homan-Sager, who helps coordinate what we're doing here and make sure that all of the technology is working. To Maura McAndrews for the flyers, and Jessica Dobson for helping to get the word out. If those of you who are listening would be interested in being on the Latin Americanist listserv, you can send me a message at ckenney@ou.edu, ckenny@ou. And I'll send you the instructions on how to sign up for that listserv, which is one of the ways that we help people know about what's going on. You can also go to the Center for the Americas webpage at any time and see flyers for upcoming events. So thank you all for your participation this afternoon, and again, especially to Dr. Carrillo for sharing with us the fruit of your labor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Bye-bye, everybody.